Hello out there, this is the irate veteran coming at you with another video. Before we start, let me thank my sponsors. Let me read this little disclaimer. I am not recommending any specific lawyer or law firm to veterans. Veterans need to conduct their own due diligence before selecting a lawyer or law firm as their representative. Mr. Greg Rada and Wesson Dunn are my sponsors, and thank you very much for being my sponsors. All right, veterans, we're coming at you with another video here on mental health. You guys I know and gals have been waiting for this video. The VA's been saying they're going to change the mental health rating schedule, and they've been saying it and been saying it and they're saying it. And we're actually going to talk about that a little bit on this video. So this is going to cover the old schedule and the new schedule, right? So it's really important, and this video will be relevant far into the future. So I have a guest with me to help me cover all of this. Greg, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Eugene. Happy to be here. Appreciate you having me on. As Eugene said, my name is Greg. I am a disabled Air Force veteran, served 2002 to 2008. And then in 2014, I started a law firm after going to law school. And I've now been representing disabled veterans against the VA for over a decade.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. I think the thing people miss a lot about mental health is, what is it really all about? You know, the more and more I look through the schedule and the way they rate things and the way they even talk about it, I mean, it's really all about impairment. How do your issues that you have mental health-wise, how are they impairing your function, impeding your life, getting in your way? Could you talk about that a little bit?
The primary goal of the VA disability compensation system is to compensate veterans for their loss in earnings capacity, which is also called functional impairment. So VA's less concerned with how your mental health condition or other disabilities affects your quality of life. They're focused on how it impacts your ability to work primarily. And with mental health specifically, they are also concerned with social impairment. So your ability to have relationships with family, friends, anyone else, coworkers. But the primary focus is occupational impairment.
On the new schedule, it talks about levels of impairment. And we'll get into that. But again, impairment, very relevant when it comes to either schedule. And statements, you know, one of the things that I've always focused on in veteran-to-veteran advice I've given veterans is, you know, you really need to talk about your issues on a statement. Because if you don't say so in a written format, it might not get into the record. The compensation and pension examiner may write everything down. He may not write everything down. He may mishear you. You really need to put it in words. Could you talk about how important statements are for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. Personal statements, witness statements are oftentimes worth their weight in gold. As you were alluding to, C&P examiners don't always write down what you tell them. And I'm finding that this is becoming more and more common as VA continues its transition to exclusively use third-party contractors to conduct C&P examinations. The issue is these large third-party companies are trying to make a profit, which means they are paying their examiners as little as possible. And I've seen in my practice that the quality of these exams is just continually decreasing. I know a lot of these C&P examiners get paid per examination, and so they are incentivized to move as quickly as possible, which then necessarily results in them missing things. And so a personal statement is your chance to protect yourself against a C&P examiner missing what you tell them. Because if you have a personal statement that describes your symptoms, the impact of PTSD on your life, and then you get an exam where the examiner doesn't address what you wrote, what you told at them, when you have to appeal the decision, you can point to your statement and be like, look, I described all these things. The examination is 5 sentences long. They missed all of this stuff, and you'll be able to get that exam thrown out.
Yeah, and you know, and another part that I really like about exams or about statements is a veteran has to sit down and write out his issues. He becomes more familiar with his own issues, and he is better able to present that to the examiner, right? So, because like I've got written here, right, winging it at the exam, you know, probably just isn't often a good idea, right?
Yeah.
You should do some preparation in thinking about what are your issues, because on the spot, you very well might not cover all of that if you haven't thought about it beforehand.
Exactly. Doing a statement forces you to think about it instead of just winging it. So it's almost like a dry run
Yeah,
when you do a written
exactly.
statement.
Let's jump like into the current schedule, which I'm calling the old schedule already. One of the things that at least is kind of good is every one of the symptoms noted here at the 100%, 70%, at all the levels is actually on the DBQ. There's a checkbox for it for, persistent delusions or hallucinations. There's a checkbox for that. That is kind of good because that could help with a rating eventually. Could you kind of take us through the schedule? And I didn't put the 10 and 30 here because I've never actually had a veteran argue for the 10 or 30. I'm sure those ratings are out there. I just had never have anyone contact me and say, I'm at 10, I'm trying to get to 30.
Right.
So I'm just not going to cover that. So, but anyway, could you talk about the schedule some?
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to point out about the current rating criteria is that the first sentence on each of these is the most important in the 100% total occupational and social impairment. That is actually the criteria for that rating. Going down to 70, occupational and social impairment with deficiencies in most areas such as work, school, family relations, judgment, thinking, or mood. That is the criteria, and so on. After each one of those sentences, it says due to such symptoms as, and then it lists all these symptoms. Those are example symptoms. And so when you're trying to get a 100% rating, you don't have to prove you actually have those symptoms. You don't have to have any of those symptoms to get 100%. You have to prove that you have total occupational and social impairment. That's the thing you have to prove. The symptoms themselves actually don't matter. We argue a lot for 70% ratings. What we're arguing is that your PTSD causes deficiencies in most areas of your life. And it doesn't matter what symptoms cause those deficiencies. We can use symptoms from the 50 or 30 rating criteria. And this is something that a lot of vets miss. They say, oh, they checked these boxes, these boxes, these boxes. I qualify for that rating. When it's actually this occupational and social impairment level, which corresponds to the rating, not the actual specific symptoms themselves.
But the symptoms can be important, as we're going to talk about here in a minute.
Sure.
Here's how the schedule looks when they actually rate it. Someone who's going to be rated 100% gets that bottom box checked where it says total, just like we just talked about. And the box above that is the 70, and then the box above that is the 50, and then the 30, and then of course the top one, which is you lost. No mental issue. And if you notice, so everything relates to impairment. Everything talks about impairment at all the levels. So one of the things about the symptoms themselves, because this impairment part, that's all going to be determined by the examiner. He's the one who's going to say where you're impaired. And that's just his judgment call. And often that judgment call may not be in line with the symptoms at their different levels. So, and here's a case, well, could you talk about this case that kind of emphasizes that symptoms, can correlate to a level of rating?
Yeah. So Bankhead versus Shulkin is an extremely important case. I was at the United States Courts of Appeals for Veterans Claims, and the court held essentially that the symptom of suicidal ideation by itself can be enough to show that you meet the criteria for a 70% rating, which again is deficiencies in most areas of your life. And the Bankhead court also talked about what is suicidal ideation. And this is extremely important because I get veterans all the time who say, I don't have suicidal ideation. I've never called the hotline. I've never had a plan. I've never made an attempt. But the court explains that suicidal ideation is any thought of suicide at all. Period. Stop. So once a year or twice a year, you get in a fight with your spouse, and the next day you think to yourself in your head, you just think, oh, my wife would be better if I'm dead. That's suicidal ideation. And you can argue for a 70% rating. It does not matter how minor it is. And you can see in this first paragraph where the court talks about this, that VA had attempted to say that, well, for for you to have suicidal ideation, you have to have a high risk of self-harm. And that's just not the case. It can be extremely minor. And, I actually kind of thought before this case came out, I kind of thought how VA did, like, because myself, I've had instances where I got in a fight with my wife and, I think, oh, I'm an idiot. She'd be better off if I were dead. And I would think to myself, oh, well, everyone has those thoughts. That's not suicidal ideation. And I talked to my wife, a few months later, and she's like, I don't have those thoughts. That's not normal. And so I want to highlight that any thought of death, any thought of suicide at all, even if it's for a couple of seconds, once or twice a year, that's still suicidal ideation. It's a very important symptom to report to the CMP examiners. The other question I get a lot is, well, are they gonna lock me up if I tell them that? And the answer is the CMP examiner is only going to consider you actually at risk of harm, where they might alert someone if they have a belief that you're gonna harm yourself, like you're gonna walk out of the exam and commit suicide. And so it's not an automatic, like, oh, you tell them, I've had thoughts of death. They're not going to lock you up for that. They only do that if they think you're an imminent risk of committing suicide. So extremely important. Put it in your personal statement if you have thoughts at all, because that can potentially get you a 70% rating.
But that same logic kind of carries through to other things on the schedule. For example, at the 100% level, it specifically says intermittent inability to perform activities of daily living. When you sit down and think about it, what are those activities? What do we do every day in our lives that maybe your mental health gives you that intermittent inability to perform those activities? And I have some things listed here, like personal hygiene activities. Everyone brushes their teeth and takes a shower. Well, it should be, exercising. A lot of veterans end up overweight. They feel so bad that they can't even, and I can tell you this myself. I've had serious depression episodes where I can barely walk to the bathroom. Just don't have the strength, right? So those daily activities in your everyday life, they're not listed on the schedule, right? But as you already noted, they don't have to be listed. Could you kind of go through some of these other things that might be the same, like that same, Bankhead case, that you might have those symptoms? You might end up with a 50% rating, but here you have all kinds of problems with your daily activities, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to be detailed in your report to the examiner. A lot of vets will just kind of be like, oh, this is just normal. And, example I get, similar to what you said, you have a depressive episode, you don't get out of bed for a day or two, you don't, brush your teeth, you don't take a shower. And so you just want to be really detailed exactly how your condition impacts you, during your daily life, because it can help get that 100% rating. Any box that the examiner can check from that 100% criteria will increase your chances of getting that 100% rating.
And again, it goes back to that statement, right? Veterans, if you're having problems with these everyday activities, or at 70% level, it also talks about near continuous panic or depression. I've talked to quite a few veterans who were in that state and they had 50% ratings. So you need to really, I think, express your issues really clearly on that statement that you're going to write, hopefully write.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to, pull up the rating schedule, have your written statement here so you can see exactly what VA is looking for when they evaluate you, and you can incorporate that criteria directly into your written statement.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that new thing's coming. The new schedule's coming. Right, for sure it's coming. Right, yes. A lot of people are thinking it's not going to come, but
it's coming.
But talk about this hearing.
Yeah, so back in June, a little over a month ago, VA testified to the House Committee on Veterans Affairs that they're expecting the new criteria to be published and finalized in early to mid fiscal year 2025. So VA's 2025 fiscal year starts this coming October 1st, so a few months away. So that would place their estimated time of completion sometime between October of 2024 through March of 2025. Wouldn't be surprised if it gets delayed a little longer than that, but it is going to come. I'd say certainly within the next year.
Yeah, so I think the hearing makes it, often when VA goes to these hearings, the things they tell the Congress people at the time maybe not happen when exactly they say it's going to happen. But, when they ask these questions to the, those people in Congress, they pretty much have to stick to it. This new schedule's coming. coming, people.
It's
So
coming.
now you have kind of an idea when that's going to happen. And could you talk about this? How is this new schedule going to match up maybe against the old one?
So I pulled these quotes from the Federal Register, which the Federal Register is where VA and other administrative agencies publish their regulations. And whenever they do a rule change like this, they're required to go through this whole process where they say, "Hey, we're thinking about making these changes." And then people can give comments to the VA, and VA has to respond to those comments. And you can read all of that in the Federal Register. You can see the suggestions that people made, questions they had, and then VA, literally replies back to those in there. And it has a lot of interesting information about why VA is doing it, what they expect the outcome's going to be. And I just thought this was interesting. VA apparently did some type of study where they evaluated how these rating changes for PTSD and other mental health conditions are going to play out. And so they said, compared to the current rating formula, fewer vets would be rated at or below the 50% disability, and more would be rated above 50%. And then the second part is that the old and the new criteria seem to yield similar results at the 70% disabling level. However, the number of vets who'd receive 100% was greater under the new rating criteria. So assuming VA's study is accurate, that's good news. And I expect that it is going to play out that way, because the difficulty with the old 100% criteria was this total occupational, total social impairment, which meant you couldn't work and essentially had total social impairment, which is like no relationships at all. So if you were married or you had a kid and you had some form of relationship, VA could always say, well, you don't have total social impairment. We're not giving you 100. And so that part's going away, that total social and occupational impairment, which I think is a good change. And hopefully it plays out that way.
So could you explain how they're actually going to rate it? They have like if anyone's familiar, and probably not, with the TBI schedule, this is very much like the TBI schedule.
Yes.
So could you talk about this for how they're going to do it?
Yeah, like you said, it's almost identical to the TBI schedule. What I'm seeing is like VA wants more objective criteria. They want like numbers tied to ratings instead of like just kind of wishy-washy, subjective, like, oh, it causes problems in your life. And I know your later slides will get into this, but they're talking about like a percentage of your time, that this symptom affects you, which I guess I understand where they're coming from, but it seems so hard to quantify mental conditions into numbers. But you'll see here, this is very similar to the TBI schedule, where they have these different domains related to your function. And the CMP examiners are going to assign a score for each domain from 0 to 4, 0 being the least impactful, 4 being total or the most impactful on you. And then once they've done that, they're going to rate it according to your scores, which you can see down below. If you have a level 1 in 2 or more domains, you get a 30% rating, all the way up to the 100%, which you either have to have one domain rated at level 4 or 2 or more domains rated at level 3. Extremely similar to TBI. TBI is the same thing. They look at 7 different areas, give you a score for each area, and then based on your highest score from one of those areas, you get a rating.
Of course, there's the 5 domains, and we're going to talk about each of those. But one of the things that I think is a little troubling to me is that there's no symptoms called out at all, which that part doesn't bother me so much. But the 100% judgment call for where you fit into these categories, that kind of bothers me. And as we look at this, and let's go into the key terms, because this is kind of what I'm talking about. On the proposed schedule that we're going to look at here in a second, it talks about these different things: frequency. Then it talks about like difficulties. It labels the difficulties as slight, clinically significant, right? Serious or profound, right? Okay, the guy you're talking to on your exam, or gal, they're the ones who's going to decide where you're at in that scale. And that goes for each one of these categories. For accommodations, even with accommodations, completed with accommodations, minor accommodations, significant, considerable.
Right.
There's so many terms that we know aren't going to be defined. So 2 different examiners may look at it differently. And what kind of bothers me the most is the last one: cannot be managed or remediated, right? That kind of bothers me, right? What does that mean? To me, that means you have to be in treatment or had to have been attempted treatment. So anyway, could you talk about these terms a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, managed or remediated, like you said, it may play out that there might be an element of you having to get treatment, which, isn't required now. I understand this. Like these words are subjective. Like you said, you could have a CMP exam today, you could have one tomorrow, and the examiners may say completely different things.
I don't know if it's going to turn out, this new schedule is going to turn out as well as people hope. I hope it does. We'll see. Let's talk about each one of the categories a little bit, right? So here's cognition. Could you take us kind of through that?
Yeah, this is a weird one for me because when I think of cognition, I always think of TBI because that's a big thing in TBIs. Cognition is like the functioning of your brain, and you can see they give some examples of what VA thinks it is. Memory, that makes sense. Concentration, that makes sense. Speed of processing information, planning, organizing, problem solving. Those seem more like TBI symptoms to me.
The TBI, they call these executive functions.
Right.
But again, here, this is another reason why statements are so important. I've been to TBI exams, a few of them, and they're not going to ask you all these things. They're going to ask you any of these things, except they might ask you about memory. But as far as, are they going to ask you like, are you having any, slowing down in the way you process information? I mean, come on, they're not
No.
going to ask that. Nor would a veteran ever think of that, to talk about that. I guess the good part is at least this schedule has a kind of a list to where now, like you were saying earlier, a veteran should look at this when they're writing their statements, right?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
all right, are you having a problem with decision making? Make sure you get that on your. I do want to just give a little warning. Just make sure that whatever you say, that you're very accurate in what you're saying about what is reality for you. Simply because if you start talking about how bad your memory is and how bad you are at making decisions, I mean, you're setting yourself for a fiduciary, right? It happens all the time in TBI. Just be careful. Just make sure you don't exaggerate. If you're really having those problems, absolutely, you need to talk about it. But if it's like every now and then, well, I'm not so sure. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've seen people get their doctors to fill out a DBQ for PTSD, and the doctor ends up checking the box that the vet can't manage their money. And that's the key indicator for VA that they're going to propose to appoint a fiduciary for you to manage your VA benefits, which is, unless you really need it, you don't want to have a fiduciary. It's a giant pain.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So let's go on to the next category: interpersonal interactions and relationships. And here, it really doesn't give any type of example. Like cognition, it pretty well laid out what they're talking about. Here, it just gives like the heading. And so I've listed some problems that veterans maybe should think about, emotional or physical intimacy problems, estrangement from, relatives, friends, whatever. You really have to put your thinking cap on. What type of problems are you having with your relationships or interactions with people? Could you talk about that some?
Yeah. I like this one because mental health conditions definitely play out on your relationships, both at work and in families and friends. It's important to get into detail with this when you're talking to the CMP examiners. A lot of people don't like talking about these issues, especially with their spouse. See all the time, vets will say, the examiner will ask them, well, how's the relationship with your wife? And the veteran says, it's good. She tolerates me. And then that's all they say. And you're not reporting the deficiencies. And so when I hear someone say, oh, she tolerates me, or she puts up with me, or she's a wonderful wife, that's making me think, well, there's probably issues that she's putting up with that make her a wonderful wife. You have to be explicit with those issues. And it's uncomfortable. It's embarrassing. You don't want to talk to this random examiner about it, but it's going to become even more important here to really get into those issues so that the examiner captures it in the report, because this is a really important symptom. And if it's occurring more than 25% of the time and it's severe, you can get that number 3. And, all you need is another number 3 and you could be at 100%.
Yeah. And that's where, again, back to statements, you really have to, I get it. I wrote a book about the VA, right? And my wife would have absolutely hated it if I had talked about her in that book. Right? So I barely touched on it, right? Because she doesn't like me to bring her into the VA stuff. And I'm sure there's other wives that kind of want to be left out of that as far as us talking about them. I know some people want to be careful about that, but this is a time where you really need to document it in your statements, the problems you're having. And if that happens to be some problems with your wife, you need to talk about that.
I think this is a good thing to highlight is that buddy statements in this type of context are going to become even more valuable.
Oh, exactly. Right. The wife's statement here would be very valuable.
Right. Coworker statements, friend statements, statements from your parents highlighting these serious difficulties in your interpersonal functioning are going to be very valuable.
Exactly. Task completion and life activities. Right. This one, when I looked through it, I was a little like, okay. I mean, it seems to be such a wide area, right? So you could talk about this category.
Yeah, it's a broad category. It's covering educational, domestic, social, or caregiving. Um, I don't know, life activities. It's a kind of a weird category. Um,
There's so many like life activities. I listed some here, but you could go on for probably pages.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, educational. So, going to school, if you're having issues, definitely want to report that. If you're going to online school because you have too much anxiety to go to in person, you want to report that. And then, domestic activities. So, cooking, cleaning, exercising, as you talked about before, I think are all going to fall into this category. I feel like it's kind of a catch-all for everything not covered by the other categories. And
And there
really,
seems to be some overlap too.
yeah, there is. And so, just talking about your quality of life and, maybe you don't go to family events because you have anxiety or you don't go out to dinner as much. Just any way that your mental health condition is impacting your life.
Right. So here's another place where, I mean, on every one of these, and we haven't talked about it on each slide, but they still have these terms, mild, moderate, severe,
Yep.
that, are all going to be subjective. It's all going to be up to examiner. We're going to be at their mercy. I will say this, though, about mental health examinations that I've had. They seem to be far more fair than the physical exams. So let's hope that stays true. But I guess we'll find out. So let's
Yeah.
move on to the next category. Navigating environments. They do have some things listed up here, right? Could you talk about these?
Yeah, this again it has a lot of overlap with TBI. The TBI schedule talks about like you being able to read a map or following GPS directions, which yeah, I mean you can get these issues from mental health as well. A great example that a therapist once told me, and I didn't understand how this worked, is I used to have a problem with road rage, and it was a combination of my mental health symptoms taking up all the bandwidth in my brain such that when something on the road bad happened, I couldn't like process it and I would get angry. And my issue is I have a problem with safety. And so I'm always scanning cars around me and trying to anticipate if they're going to make a stupid move. And that takes up all the bandwidth in my mind. And my daughter, might be talking to me in the back seat. I'm not hearing what she's saying because I'm focused on everything around me. She gets upset and then I get upset and it's not good. And so I think that example can kind of apply to navigating in environments, leaving the home, navigating and driving. I think this is a great example of how a mental health condition can impact this area.
Right. And it also talks about like a lot of veterans do have problems in confined or crowded spaces. And, so it's important to talk about anything really navigating environments. I guess it's kind of an apt name here. Think about what environments do you navigate through, right? And that could be going to the fair or going to the store or using public transportation, right? So again, veterans, if you're having, these type of things, get it documented on a statement. And this is the last category, self-care, kind of self-explanatory.
Yeah, I mean, self-care is pretty straightforward. VA's examples are hygiene, dressing appropriately, or taking nourishment. Taking nourishment would be eating, but I would also say it would be overeating or undereating. And so this is kind of, similar to that 100% criteria that we talked about before, your ability to maintain activities of daily living.
When I think about, self-care, I mean, there's so many things that I think go with that. For example, going to the store and getting your self-care products, right? A lot of veterans have problems going to the store and walking around, and shopping for things, right? And all right, you're not going to be able to wash yourself very well if you don't have the proper soap, right? Or, shampoo, or preparing meals. You have to go buy the groceries, get the right things to cook your meals. I've talked to so many veterans that they just go and they buy something they're going to throw in the microwave or the oven that's ready made, because they just don't have the patience to go through and shop for healthy foods.
Right.
I think it's really important for veterans to think really deep about any problems that you're having with self-care. So anyway, this is our last category. And, I'm kind of pointing out that all of this is going to be the complete 100% judgment call of the examiner. There's no more symptoms actually listed at different levels that you could argue I probably should have had a 70 because I talked about suicidal ideation. Now all of that will be gone on this new schedule. So this is going to be our end. Do you have anything else to say about the new schedule, or for that matter, the old schedule?
I'm cautiously optimistic that the new schedule is going to be easier to work with, especially if I need to get a client an independent psychiatric evaluation. I have examiners that I think are going to be able to hopefully get more veterans 100% using this 2-3, having 2 domains marked as a 3 severity can get you that 100. My biggest concern is this 25%. It's just hard to like is that like during your awake time, or is that 25% of a 24-hour day?
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, it's not going to be defined, right? So each examiner is going to have their own definition of what that means. I guess I'm with you, cautiously optimistic. It's like I said, I think the VA mental health examiners are a step above the physical examiners. And I'm just hoping it turns out as well as we all hope it does. And the nice thing about the 3 level, the total level always requires that cannot be managed or remediated. But the 3s, the severe impairment, that doesn't require that remediated or managed aspect. So hopefully those, people could get a better rating by getting, 2 of the 2s or 2 of the 3s. We'll just have to wait and see.
Another thing that I'm really excited about is getting rid of this total occupational impairment, because it was so hard to get a 100% rating for PTSD if you were working. I've seen it done, but it's really difficult. And now that's gone. And I think this 2-3s is going to make it relatively easier to get that 100%, and you'll be able to still work.
Exactly. And of course, a lot of people are talking about there's going to be no 0% rating anymore. The minimum rating is 10. But at the same time, I've never had a veteran argue that they're happy with that 10, right?
I think 30 is the absolute minimum that anyone should be at if they have symptoms.
Yeah, me too, because I only just speak for myself, and you've already talked about you had some issues too. There are times where I really am completely dysfunctional.
Yep.
People wonder, why have I only made 2 or 3 videos a year some years? Well, that's why, right? But anyway, so I think we've said what we need to say. So say goodbye.
Well, again, thanks for having me. Always happy to join you, and hopefully your audience finds this useful, and looking forward to hopefully this playing out in favor of our vets.
Exactly. So Irate Veteran is out.